So as we all know that the stakeholder engagement is one of the most important aspects of the IM modeling. Whenever we do modeling, we need to do stakeholder engagement at various levels, starting from the start till the end where we are doing the outreach. So here we have a set of papers that basically explain the process of stakeholder engagement that each of these papers have dealt with, and look forward to all the papers. And now I would ask, I think, Katrina to please present her presentation on the participatory system dynamic modeling for local action on the SDGs.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Katrina SZETEY, and I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri lands in Melbourne, Australia. I would like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri elders, past, present, and emerging, and further acknowledge that these are unceded lands and that reconciliation will begin with treaty. I'm based in the Planet A Sustainability Science Group at Deakin University. My co-authors are Anayat Moelmi and Brett Bryan, and I'm here today to talk to you about participatory modelling for sustainability at the local scale. So I'll begin with a quick overview of the greater research project that my work forms a part of. It's called the Local SDGs Program. So the goal of this program is to chart pathways to the Sustainable Development Goals at the local scale, because we believe that the SDGs will only be fully realised through a combination of global, national and local implementation. Not only that, but we think that local scale SDG achievement also contributes to national and global achievement. So what we mean by local SDGs is a subset of locally relevant SDGs. So for example, SDG 14, life below water, isn't likely to have a strong impact on inland communities that aren't near the sea. So that wouldn't be locally relevant. We think that a key factor in enabling success at the local scale is to engage directly with communities. So that's fundamentally, I guess, the difference between bottom-up approaches, where change would be driven by the community, and top-down approaches, which can be seen particularly at the local scale as an imposition from above, particularly from government. The Local SDGs program is testing our research with 2 case studies in regional Australian communities. I'm working with one of these 2 communities, a small town in Victoria, Australia named FORREST, which has a population of approximately 250 people. The traditional owners of this land are the Gadibanud and Gulidjan peoples, and its cultural heritage is managed by the Eastern Ma. FORREST is a former logging community and has some dairy farming and other agriculture, which is in decline. The town is in transition to other economic sectors, including tourism. It's located in a beautiful part of the world, right next to a national park, but this also increases the community's bushfire risk. There is entrenched historical disadvantage in the population, and many people are worried that tourism will have a negative effect on the community's diversity. So I'll address the question of why we think local modelling is important. And I guess when I say local modelling, that's equivalent to bottom-up modelling, which is also equivalent to participatory modelling, which is why I hope you're attending this session at the conference. As I've already said, we believe the SDGs will only be achieved through a combination of top-down and bottom-up approaches. But when you think of integrated assessment models, I'm fairly certain you'd be thinking of top-down modelling. So we think that bottom-up modelling also has a lot to contribute to the IAM world, because there is much greater diversity at the local scale, which means there's more variation and specificity in the pathways that we can construct with our models. This sort of contextualised modelling is important for achievement of the SDGs, because then we can design pathways to solutions with local knowledge. For local scale modelling to be successful, it's essential to involve the community. So I'll talk a little about our modelling approach, which is system dynamics modelling. So even though my case study is quite small, there are still many interacting sectors, and system dynamics has the capacity to model multiple sectors. And further, for modelling how the SDGs are interconnected with their synergies and trade-offs. Also important for the socio part of the socio-economic or socio-ecological, it can cope with more conceptual variables. For example, something like inequality, which can be difficult to quantify. For our purposes in involving stakeholders, we feel it's an ideal method for participatory modelling because it relies more on an understanding of the system, something which is relatively intuitive and can be easily explained to non-technical contributors. The development of a system dynamics model is an iterative process. So you're continually refining and changing the model as your understanding of the system increases, allowing a great amount of detail and diversity to be incorporated if needed. And this type of modelling is now being increasingly used for global change analysis. So I've listed a few on the slide here. My co-author, Annie Moamley, recently published a review of systems modelling for local sustainability, which is our area of focus here. Okay, so now I'll get to talking about the actual model that we built. Our first step was to define the model boundary, which in the terms of the multi-sectoral model meant defining the sectors we wanted to model. So we've undertaken several phases of community engagement in FORREST. And from that, we've learned that the concerns, needs, and opportunities of the people there. Excuse me. From this, we identified driving forces, and from each of those driving forces, we defined a sector. So you can see them listed on the right of the slide here. For each sector, we defined problems that we learned from the community and proposed a dynamic hypothesis for each problem, where we try to understand the causes of those problems. From there, we designed the model structure based on those problems and dynamic hypotheses. To reduce development time, we reviewed the literature to find existing models describing our sectors and problems that we could reuse and incorporated them where possible. However, there was a gap in the research for sectors like inequality, telecommunications, and public transport, particularly at the local scale. So we did have to design those from scratch. We were keen to make the interconnections between sectors a key focus, as this is a strength of system dynamics modelling. And it distinguishes a multi-sectoral model from just a model that has many components. Importantly, we did not build our model in a vacuum. So the design was informed by our earlier work with the community, but then we also returned to the community and conducted a group model building workshop so they could build their own version of the model with their understanding of how the sectors in their community interacted. We elected not to show them our version of the model, and instead we kept it at a high conceptual level and still obtained a rich second data set with which we could validate and confirm the work that we had already done. I've just got a couple of slides here showing the process. So in the top left was our instructions to the participants. Around this room that you can see in the picture in the bottom, we had very large posters for each model sector. That sector was listed, written in the middle of the poster, and then surrounding that we had the other sectors. And we just asked everyone to write on the poster how those sectors interacted. As you can see the example here, the bush is good for physical and mental health is one way in which biodiversity and health and wellbeing interact. And just to give you an idea of the outcome, so this is an example of one of those completed posters with all the data that we got from the community there. So leading on from these results, we created a conceptual map of the interactions between the model sectors. This is important to understand as it can help with knowing how levers can have an impact on seemingly unrelated factors in different parts of the model. We can also gauge which are the most impactful sectors and most impacted through looking at the numbers of outgoing and incoming connections between the sectors, which is also something that sensitivity and uncertainty analysis can also highlight, especially making sure that the conceptual understanding that we have of the system is also built into how the model functions. So this image on the left shows a heat map of the sensitivity of key outcome variables in the model to inputs. And the image on the right shows the uncertainty envelope of those key outcome variables. Okay, so we've built the model, but now what? The model design and initial runs are based on a BAU scenario. Last year, we co-developed a strategic plan with the community, synthesizing all of our collected knowledge with defined priorities for sustainability. Our model will quantify how to achieve those priorities and implement community-identified solutions and what the final impact will be. We've also co-developed qualitative local pathways for sustainability based on the SSTs. And this model will allow us to quantify and test those pathways. This also has a broader impact, as the paper from O'Neill and colleagues from last year on the future of the SSP framework identified that SSP scenario development should be more inclusive, should improve regional applicability, and improve relevance beyond climate. So here our work, based on the SSPs, is much more stakeholder driven, is locally relevant, and is extended out to a sustainability context. And with that, I'd like to conclude by thanking the people of FORREST, our funders at the Ian Potter Foundation, and the IAMC conference organisers for giving me the opportunity to share my work with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katrina, to finishing the presentation on time. Can you please, Alexandros, ask your question?
Yes, sure. Thank you. Yeah, well, basically the question was, if I understand correctly, you asked, thank you very much also for the presentation, right? So it was very interesting. Did you ask, you asked the people there to put together their own posters, right? So each individual built their own, let's say, model in a sense?
So the group as a whole built the model, I guess, in the sense that they told us what those interconnections were, and then I went away and put that into the model.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, that was my question, because I understand that if you had multiple models, then it would be a mess to try to create one, like condense and refine and so on and so forth. That's why I'm asking.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, no, so we treated it more like that we had our primary data set with which I built the first, the original version of the model, and then we kind of validated that with the second independent, version of the data collected from the community.
Thank you very much.
I just have a follow-up question. So once you've collected the data and you're doing the model, now for the future scenarios, the community as well as the government may have two different future pathways. And how do you basically work on that to find a middle path, or just to inform the community, this is what their scenario looks like? And have you done, if you have, what was the reaction of the community?
So we actually, if we're talking about the scenarios that we're going to then test, we actually co-developed those with the community as well. So that was an earlier phase of the research. So we have these qualitative scenarios that we've designed, very based in the same, along the same lines as the SSPs are, but in a sustainability context. And then we're going to use the model to then test the validity of those, or and quantify those scenarios. I'm not actually at that stage of the work yet, so I'm not fully across how that's going to happen, but that's our next phase of work.
Okay. Look forward to your work. It's very, very interesting. Thank you so much, Katrina. I will ask the next presenter to please go ahead and present the slide. So Alexandros would be presenting on co-creating a model inter-comparison exercise with stakeholders in the EU. The floor is yours, Alexandros.
Thank you, Saritha. Thank you, and hi again. So, well, Shivika pretty much covered part of the framing about the project. As Shivika nicely put it, within the project, we have strived to ensure policy relevance and ownership of the research process and the modeling results. So the biggest step and perhaps challenge to that has been in finding ways to engage with stakeholders and co-creating and co-create, let's say, our modeling exercise with them. So for the purpose of this session, I will be focusing primarily on the co-creation, let's say, methodological framework that we adopted rather than the model results themselves, which means that I may be spending disproportionate amount of time in the next few slides. So this co-creation started taking shape in mid-2019 when we kicked off a several-month consultation process. We got in touch with high-level policymakers from the European Commission, introduced them to the project, and asked them to provide us with topics that they would see, let's say, they would be most interested in us doing research in. And after some filtering, we ended up with a list of close to 20 topics, which we grouped into 3 thematic, let's say, classes or groups. global level topics, EU specific, and then anything else that's related to broader sustainability issues. So we then held a physical workshop in Brussels, Belgium in November 2019, and stakeholders were basically invited based on their, let's say, displayed interest in previous relevant EU climate policy events, which resulted in a sample of more than 800 invitations. So, but for 24 hours before the event kickoff, we used Slido to crowdsource more policy topics from the public in some form of public consultation. And then in an admittedly stressful process in the morning of the event, we did some refining and then incorporate the most popular topics across its themes. So basically we added 3 more to our list. And then it was workshop days, so 57 individuals participated physically, including high-level staff from relevant ECDGs, relevant governmental bodies and ministries across member states, international NGOs, business representatives, and scientists. Admittedly, no citizens, but the event was very well promoted and was also live streamed, so everyone was invited to join virtually. So the workshop itself was organized in 5 sessions. In the first one, we handed out a policy brief, which covered how models work and what they can and cannot do. And this was accompanied by a presentation and a live panel discussion with Q&As with the audience about our models and what policy questions they have been used in the past, so far to address. So this helped, cultivate better expectations among the stakeholders about what to expect, probably. Then there was a second session, which focused mostly on on launching really the IAM Paris platform prototype. And then in that session, we also asked stakeholders, we allowed them to vote on specifications they would like to see in the platform. And this also helped, it served as a way of getting people familiar with the idea of using Slido as a live polling tool for the first time, which would be relevant and helpful for the next session. So the afternoon consultation then, it was broken down into 3 thematic sessions, unsurprisingly, each one corresponding to each of the themes. And it was chaired by, each session was chaired by 4 consortium members. And in each session, a chairperson would spend something like 10 minutes to introduce all the topics, well, basically each topic of the list to the audience, and explain that before, asking the audience to vote via Slido which topics they would like during that session, so in the day, to discuss with us and, with everybody basically in the room. So, and we allowed this process, we opened this process to everyone, whether physically or virtually attending. So we also had votes from people just watching the event from their homes or offices and so on. So given the range of topics, which was quite large, and the time limitations for each session, it was critical to enable discussions over the most interesting and most pertinent topics. So after the selection of topics, the floor was open for discussion among chairs and audience. So we kicked off, let's say, a discussion on each topic for a few minutes, then stakeholders were able to share any questions or remarks of the proposed topics. Following this discussion, a further round of Slido voting allowed stakeholders to vote which topics they would like us to do research. So again, recapping, first round, let's say, of stakeholder Slido voting, selecting which topics we should be discussing. We gave something like 10 minutes for the first topic, 8 minutes for the second one, or, until anyway, the questions ended and so on and so forth to cover the most interesting topics. And then another round of Slido voting to ensure that, to allow stakeholders to vote what they would like from the original list. They would like the project to pursue, let's say, to do more research in. So this process eventually led to a synthesis of research questions and a scenario framework that should be able to accommodate modeling that actually addresses these questions. Here you can very briefly see all topics in the original list, including those topics that were crowdsourced, so the final ones. We can get back to that slide if necessary, but perhaps more interestingly, here you can see that the finally selected topics for doing research. So basically during the first session, stakeholders chose to discuss everything related to behavioral changes in modeling, and then potential failure of key technologies coupled with game-changing innovations. After the discussion, so during the subsequent voting process on what we should follow up on, they also added to that list a frank, let's say, realistic account of where the world is headed, and which also served as the scenario framework eventually. In the second session, focusing on Europe, stakeholders chose to discuss and to do more research in electrification and hydrogen. And then in the final session on broad sustainability issues, although some stakeholders mainly coming from research and academia chose issues related to cross-sectoral, let's say, distributional impacts and basically the decline of carbon-intensive sectors. Stakeholders overall eventually upvoted investments, employment, and relevant socioeconomic implications. So from this point onwards, I suspect this is not as interesting to the session itself, to this specific session. So I'll try to be as brief as possible. The scenario protocol makes for a very nice and quite interesting discussion and long one. It was held yesterday. It was presented by my colleague Jan van de Ven. And in essence, it just tried to, let's say, give flesh to the idea of capturing where the world and the EU are headed given the current policies and pledges. And the harmonization protocol, also very interesting discussion, is considering also we are talking about 11 models that you can see here, is also is currently, in fact, being presented by my colleague Sarah Gerola from Imperial in the method session. So very quickly, we addressed the first, let's say, the main question of where the world is headed with all models, let's say. So expectedly currently implementing policies in the EU are not adequate to meet, to really achieve the new target of 55% by 2030. And that kind of makes sense because we used policies currently in place. But all models predicted that the outdated, let's say, target of 40% is actually attainable without even raising ambition, which is thankfully the case. But for 2050, expectedly, again, we're not even close to net zero, but even with nets, I mean, there's a critical, there's a large gap. And the intermodal differences were actually also reflected in the projected energy systems across the models. We also saw that without action delivered on the EU's latest, newest increased climate ambitions as reflected in the new NDC and the overall neutrality, let's say, vision by 2050. CCS deployment are actually critical to achieving deep emissions cuts and nearing, anyway, the climate targets, which actually justifies and underpins the concern from the stakeholders over the potential failure of this technology. Regarding security of supply, import dependency was seen to decrease in time, over time, which attests to future low carbon energy systems relying less and less on imports, which in this case were substituted by energy savings in the EU and domestic energy resources. All models foresaw a growth of electricity penetration in the transport sector, most with a steep increase, along with decarbonization. Only two models, GCAM and NIES, actually showed a slightly lower slope, but overall increase nevertheless. Regarding hydrogen, CCS seems to play a pivotal role also in the diffusion of hydrogen, with most hydrogen produced post-2040, given current policies, being blue from CCS integrated resources, which is nonetheless significantly outperformed by electrification. So I'm completely skipping the final set of questions because, frankly, the idea was to reach a realistic baseline to use in the future mitigation modeling studies. So basically, we didn't have, let's say, a more elaborate counterfactual scenario to compare socioeconomic implications against. So right to the chase regarding novelty, this process helped many modeling teams actually extract the information that is relevant to what concerns stakeholders, decision makers, and understand these topics instead of simply anchoring to those overly highlighted, typically highlighted issues in relevant multimodal studies. It helped us adopt a scenario logic that is underrepresented in the literature. And of course, hopefully, it helped us make some progress towards inclusiveness and legitimacy and increased trust in the modeling processes and the results. But despite, let's say, the progress there, we we are far from, anyway, we acknowledge that there's a long and challenging way to claiming real co-production of knowledge, which would at the very least entail a standardized co-creative scenario process. I'm again iterating here that the scenario frame was not directly, let's say, co-produced with stakeholders, but rather we developed that after the event based on our interpretation of the discussions and how they moved. We should be able to loop results back to those engaged so that they could evaluate the extent to which the results were novel and useful and in line with their expectations and practical, so they could transform into action. And then we reckon it would be far more difficult and challenging to really engage stakeholders, citizens in this process. It would need some tweaks and modifications, admittedly. We did not have citizens in this workshop. So overall caveats, again, the model policies were those in place in 2020. So really the EU 2030 climate and energy framework. So no discussion about Fit for 55, always room for higher extensive harmonization. Again, this discussion is currently being carried out by Sarah in the session of the method session, sorry. And then we were not able to address all the upvoted topics. So for example, behavioral change, we had to produce a different study seeing to what extent and how, what are the steps forward to incorporating behavioral change and lifestyle changes in energy modeling. We only partially touched upon the potential failure of CCS, and we didn't really do anything about the decline of carbon-intensive sectors and distributional impacts. So pretty much that's it from my side. Again, thank you very much, and very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Alexandros. We have a couple of minutes, so if anyone from the audience has a question, please feel free to ask to Alexandros. We have Cornelia. Please, Cornelia.
Hi, Alexandros. Thanks a lot for this interesting talk. You said in the end that you were not able to address a specific or a few questions that you obviously would have liked to address. What would have been needed that you would have been able to address them? 3 more years, or like?
Well, honestly, this is just a study. So the truth, well, there are many factors here, right? So first of all, there's some aspects are not very easily modeled, right? So they're hard to model, like behavioral change. It's a very challenging task. It would take a lot of, well, you would know that there are many projects looking into that and how to do that adequately and sufficiently and so on and so forth. Then it was a matter of producing a study that actually has a stop and deals. So I didn't even show everything that we did in that study, but when you think of it in the form of a whatever, like a project deliverable or a research study or even a paper, which eventually was created, you have to, have a, you have to organize what you have to prioritize and so on and so forth. But it didn't really help the fact that we were looking into where we are headed. So you can really look into socioeconomic implications and compare against what, when your entire case is that the no policy or unrealistic, let's say, reference baselines do not work. So you have to provide a new one. So against what are you really, comparing? So things like that.
I will request now the next presenter, Cornelia, to present on the climate change scenario services. Please, Cornelia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot for having me today and to present our vision of the climate change scenario services. Here you find also my co-authors and the respective institutes, which we co-produced that vision. So what I will present today is not so much a stakeholder process that we had, but more of an intermediary service infrastructure and the vision of it that we developed in order to enhance the information of climate change scenarios and make them better available for decision makers, stakeholders, and society. And our vision is that this will then be an intermediary infrastructure supporting stakeholder processes and the mutual exchange between science and stakeholders. And just to give you a short background, so the Census project was the start of this work, where we produced a toolkit for climate change scenarios and portals with over a 3-year-long stakeholder process with very intense consultations, and finally the vision of such a climate change scenario service. We put that into a perspective piece in One Earth. And why would we claim that climate change scenario services are important? I think we all agree that climate change scenarios are an important tool for the co-production of knowledge between science and stakeholders, but they also should be used for strategic planning by our stakeholders, and that would really require to enhance the usability of the scenario information that we have. And probably many of you know this famous claim by Cash et al. That any knowledge service should provide legitimacy, credibility, and salience to its information. And we believe that climate change scenarios have legitimacy and credibility to a great extent by, commonly by the usage of commonly accepted outlets like the IPCC reports, but especially with respect to mitigation scenarios, we feel that the salience is more underdeveloped, and salience means that this information should become tangible and relevant to a broader audience. And we wanted to establish a vision for a service that enhances the salience of climate change scenarios. And let me go into detail. So the vision also encompasses not only mitigation and socioeconomic scenarios, but it also holds for climate change projections, impact projections, and also adaptation scenarios. And the idea was to make this information available not only to policymakers that are kind of used to using scenarios to some extent, but we also saw a growing interest from new influential groups like from finance and economy that need forward-looking tools, for example, for risk assessment or alignment of economic or financial activities. But we also had in mind regional actors where the colleagues in our consortium saw this gap between mostly global quantitative information scenarios and then the local work with more narrative, qualitative scenarios. And there is a gap that should be closed, and this could also be supported by such a scenario service. And we developed like 6 decisive pillars that we see that would be central to such climate change scenario service, and I will walk you through these now in the subsequent slides. So the first pillar we saw is really adequacy. So the service needs to provide adequate information, meaning it touches the reality of the user. It shows what are climate change scenarios and how do they relate to the reality of the user. And like this, the information has to be provided by a consequent perspective switch, starting at the user questions and avoiding scientific jargon. And one important feedback that we received from our stakeholders is that this service and the provided information needs to be relevant to them. It's really important that there is adequate data there. For example, in the example of mitigation scenarios, that there are realistic near-term trends that can be used and can be trusted, or that there is a higher granularity and precision for the individual sectors and regions. And like this, if the data is more adequate, then automatically it also becomes more useful to the stakeholders. And contextualization is something that we also see as a very central aspect, meaning that the service needs to provide the information so that scenarios are correctly understood and used. So which informations do climate change scenarios cover and which not? And that scenarios, for example, are no predictions, but they're a set of assumptions. And if we vary these assumptions, there would be different outcomes so that they are not misused. That's really important. Then capacity building is something that we also put in the center of such a service. As I said before, we had quite diverse stakeholders with interest to climate change scenarios and also with diverse backgrounds. So we believe that such a service structure should have staged access So providing different levels of complexity, having modular content, and that it is accessible also for newcomers, but always state-of-the-art scientific results also for experienced users that really want to work with the data. And this is, I was talking about the census project, this is how we addressed it there. We had an architecture where we provided learn modules for understanding the basic concepts, and then exploration modules with more diving into the data, and finally a download area where users could take away the data and apply it in their environment. Just to show you one example, here we have an entry learning module where we explain what is net zero pathways and what is required, and just that they get an intuition of what these scenarios cover in information. And then we have really dashboards of decisive information and variables which they can learn, where they can learn which variable answers which question or which set of variables. And then finally there's this download area. In that case it was a scenario explorer from YASA, where we would direct them then and there they could download the data and then employ it in their environment. So really a service from start to using the data in the end. Then another important pillar we see in such a service structure is visualization. I think probably everybody agrees that it helps a lot to convey a multitude of complex interrelated information. And it's just very helpful if you want to convey the information in scenarios. Then transparency, this is something that already Frank and Shivika were also alluding to. It's really important that the users have trust in such a service. They deal with high impact consequences. We did a first step where we provided in this census toolkit references to the paper and to the data, but of course it would be great if there is more information available on model setup or the inner logic of scenario generation, so that there is a higher trust and then finally uptake. And we also see, despite we want to provide a service infrastructure, on the short run, we don't see that this service structure would function completely standalone with stakeholders. We think that co-production will remain an important aspect and concept in order to not only provide the data to the stakeholders, but also to get the information back, because a lot of information is not adequate yet. And this is also something that was reflected before by the speakers, and co-production can help a lot towards that. We also distinguish between two types of co-production. There's a co-production of scenarios, but also the co-production of scenario knowledge. Like if now the IPCC report of Working Group 3 will be published, then sometimes it's not necessary to have yet another new set of scenarios, but rather to work with the existing scenarios and create scenario knowledge from that. And for our co-production that we did during the project, we also provided some manuals for co-production, one for working with global stakeholders from business, finance, policy, but also for co-producing knowledge with local and regional stakeholders. So you can look it up there. We did, we make quite some effort to collect all the insights we had. Like we also did some user stereotypes as opener, and we got really good support also from Berlin Startup, which is into design thinking, and we really collected everything and put it into those manuals. And now back to the climate change scenario services. Of course, what would be the way forward? It would be nice if all the efforts that currently in the community are taken, where people do good outreach or do prepare stakeholder material, it would be great if there was a service infrastructure available that would go beyond the usual lifespan of projects, and if this infrastructure could evolve with user needs. But the question, of course, is what would be the setup? Would it be a central hub or rather a distributed system of services? So would it be one service or would it be a multitude of services? but we would like to encourage that there should be at least some basic institutional setup and curation so that quality, usability, and basal maintenance are ensured. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. And yeah, please visit our census toolkit, but also a follow-up project with the NGFS group, which is also a climate change scenario service. Thanks.
Maybe I'll ask a question from a stakeholder's perspective on the use of the services.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on their experience and the age and how the services are used could differ. So it could be used, the data could be used in a very informative manner, or it could be used as saying, if a next set of scenario comes into place, what were the earlier set of scenarios based on? So what were the challenges that you feel while developing these services that came up from the current users that you felt that needs to be really need to be worked on in the services right now?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there are many challenges, I would say, but one challenge is certainly to really drag the information that the users need to the front, because many times the results are as they are, but the users have different questions, and it really needs a recompilation of the data that's there. And you really, sometimes it's also very helpful if you start computing some indicators, etc. But of course, you need to connect with the users, and you really need to find out what they need. And then another challenge is, of course, also that of transparency. That that you provide all that inner logic that is there, and that which is like implicit knowledge, making the implicit explicit. This is also a great challenge. And then probably I could talk half an hour about further challenges.
Yeah. Thank you, Cornelia. Thank you for the fantastic presentation. And now I would very much ask the last presenter, Elmar, who would actually be looking at and giving an example from a financial sector perspective. So Elmar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Saritha. Good. Yeah, so I will talk about work with the financial sector, and in particular the network for greening the financial system, where we, and I maybe move to the next slide, join forces with them to provide climate scenarios for financial analysis, in particular climate-related financial risk. So the NGFS is a network of central banks and regulators, which by now covers most of the world's central banks, I think, and regulators. So 5 continents, over 90 members by now. And they're organized in work streams. And one work stream is the work stream on macro financial risks. And here the focus is indeed on developing reference climate scenarios for central banks and supervisors to allow them to analyze these macro financial risk from climate change. And here both the risks of climate policy, which they call transition risk, as well as the risk of climate change itself, which they call physical risk, is relevant. The consortium consists of these institutions that you see on the right-hand side. So integrated assessment modeling teams, GChem, Riemann Magpie, the message Globio model are part of that. We have a group working on climate impacts, or 2 groups here, from ETH Zurich and Climate Analytics. And then in phase 2, there was also a macroeconometric model framework added from the National Institute for Economic and Social Research. Now, this is the case that the NGFS is making for using scenarios for climate-related financial risk analysis. And this argument is something that for scenario modelers is very familiar, and that is also a main argument for using scenarios in the climate policy context, which is that it will matter, climate change will matter, and that was an important thing and recognition in the finance sector over the past 2 or 3 years, that climate-related financial risk is really material to them. This is not a sideshow, but it really matters. and it's highly uncertain. And it depends not only on exogenous uncertainties. We as humans are agents in this game. So it is dependent on our action and choices. And therefore, scenarios offer a very good tool in the presence of this agency, in the presence of this very high uncertainty, to explore financial risk in a what-if framework. And scenarios can exactly explain this what-if framework. On the right-hand side, you see a conception of the NGFS, both of the use cases and the users. So with the NGFS scenarios in the center, there are different sets of users. You can see the NGFS members here. That's basically the regulators. There's the academia, including not only, of course, scenario modelers and climate change researchers, but also a lot of people who are working on the finance sector itself as academics. And then we have private sector actors, like, for example, financial firms in the broader industry. And there's all kinds of different uses that we could think of. And for scenarios relevant is particularly the distinction between middle-of-the-road type of scenarios, central scenarios that give indications on alignment with policy targets, and stress testing scenarios that look also at shocks and extreme outcomes and give information about stability and tail risk. Now, the first step in this exercise was, and there were two phases to it. So I'm talking here about phase 2, because phase 1, it was mostly using existing scenarios given the time pressure and then contextualizing it for the NGFS. In phase 2, we really developed new scenarios in a co-design process with the NGFS. And they called it bespoke scenarios. That's a new English word I learned. It sounds very special. So we developed these bespoke scenarios along these 6 narratives that you see on the left-hand side. And the idea here really was to fill a scenario matrix of different what-if assumptions that the NGFS set out from the start. And for them, it was important to think holistically, to not only think about transition risk, but also about physical risk. So you have these 2 axes. And then, of course, on the side of the physical risks, you have a set of scenarios that reach the ambitious climate targets and a set of scenarios that don't, and that differentiates them along this axis. On the other axis, you have a set of scenarios that try to do this in an orderly way on the policy side. That predominantly means coordinated, both sectorally coordinated as well as globally coordinated. And then a set of scenarios where it would be less coordinated, and that was called disorderly. So we came up with these 6 narratives. There were 2 that tried to extend current policies and national determined contributions. There were 2 that looked at orderly transitions from here to below 2 degrees or to a 1.5 degree type of world, where in particular in the latter, it became relevant to already include some of the net zero targets to be policy relevant. And then there are disorderly ones that basically introduced delayed transition so that you would have some disruptive change of course in 2030, and also divergence between sectors. That was another formulation here. This gives you an overview about the individual conceptions, or the conception of risk along these for these 6 different narratives in a number of dimensions. So the first dimension here is policy, is physical risks. I talked about this before. There are different temperature outcomes, and the higher the warming, the greater the physical risk. The transition risk side has been much more elaborated in the context of the phase 2 work, where we included for the policy reaction whether it would be immediate and smooth. We have to admit no policy reaction in the situation we are in, because there has been so much delay already, will be smooth, but as much as it can be. This was introduced in the orderly worlds. And then we had 2 cases where once we had the delay, as I said before, and the other one where there was a sectoral divergence. So in these cases, there was a higher carbon price in the transport and in the building sector, which basically was pushing out oil much faster than in a world where we would have a globally or a sectorally homogeneous carbon price. We didn't have a globally homogeneous carbon price because we had this regional specific targets built in until 2050 in all cases. Technology change was different, and then a big discussion was about the regional policy variation, which I just alluded to, particularly in these national target cases was a significant regional variation. And the last important point was carbon dioxide removal. So there was a general request to not have huge amounts of carbon dioxide removal in the scenarios, and the recognition that for the 1.5 degree worlds, it still would be significant. You can see the result of this debate here. So first, an important message to stakeholders was to say there's a difference between the net CO2 emissions and the gross CO2 emissions. Both information is important. You see that on the left-hand side. You can see that for the net zero scenario, there were about 6 gigatons that were removed by carbon dioxide removal. The model in 2050, the models did this in different ways. 2 models here, they use particular bioenergy with CCS. Another model focused more on afforestation in this context. So that was an element of the uncertainty analysis we did, but we try to keep it at maximum 6 gigatons per year. Now this gives you an overview of what came out. You see the CO2 emissions on the left-hand side and corresponding carbon prices on the right-hand side for the example of one model. And you can already see the disorderliness in one scenario, which is a delay scenario, where you have really a change of course in 2030 and a jump in carbon price. The disorderliness in the purple scenario, which is the sectoral differentiation, is not so clearly visible here, but you can see it that the global average carbon price here is much higher because you had these very high carbon prices in the transport and building sector. Now, important was to communicate uncertainty. That was also important to the NGFS, even though it makes things more complicated for stakeholders. Because there is not one projection or forecast of the future. And we achieved that by really having 3 models here, which is quite effective to communicate that these results depend also on model assumptions. Now I want to go through a few user needs, and we may have to do this very quickly, that came up during the process, and we try to cater to also when we moved from phase 1 to phase 2 of the scenario work. First is spatial granularity. Users really would like to get this transformation information on the country level, and the global models don't provide it. So in this project, we developed a downscaling method for some, of course not all variables, particularly energy variables, that would then give you national transitions for countries. And the downscaling method developed by YASA and climate analytics consisted in taking the long-term regional projections from the IEMs, combine it with short-term country trends, have conditional convergence of the short-term trends to the IEM trends, but then include policy adjustments of the country-specific context in this convergence algorithm to take this into account to come up with the final pathways. Another user need, very big one, is sectoral granularity, where it's basically about greater detail, particularly in the end-use sectors. You can see the example on the right-hand side. If we look at the emissions intensity in various sectors, and we break out the industry sector to steel, cement, chemicals, other industry. So having information like this on subsectors, having information about the amount of electric vehicles on the road and these kind of things are very important for financial risk analysis. And that's another ask on the integrated assessment models to provide that granularity. User need number 3 was that people would like to know, how do you compare with other scenarios that are very prominent in the debate and are serving as a benchmark for many discussions. In our case, these were the International Energy Agency scenarios, particularly the net zero publication, that came out in spring 2021, and also relating our results back to the 1.5 degree report and the scenario database there. And you can see this is a graph that we put together to inform that discussion, where you can see that the three models that produce the NGFS scenarios are quite aligned with the IEA net zero scenarios in many variables. But compared to the 1.5 degree report, there's really a less carbon dioxide removal, less bioenergy, and higher renewable shares. Now, user need number 4 is to really inform the transition risk. So the question is, we now have these scenarios and they have some granularity, but what can people do with it when they want to understand financial risk, transition risk for their particular question? The first thing is to recognize what are the drivers of risk. One is very important in this context, the fossil fuel sector. So how are oil, coal, and gas demand developing, and how are the associated prices developing is an important question, but also other things like shifts in investments from high carbon to low carbon activities, as well as CO2 pricing are important risk factors. So what we did was, not only in this project, but also from another project, we developed a framework where the risk elements in the scenarios were distilled into so-called risk factor pathways that would provide for a given sector, like the utility sector, 3 levels of risk. One is the direct costs due to greenhouse gas policies. So that is the CO2 price risk that you would have as a markup on your product. The second one is the indirect costs, where it's in the supply chain. So upstream costs, you have higher input prices. And the third one is increased capital expenditure in low carbon alternatives. That was combined into these risk factor pathways, and that's something that the users then could take and do more detailed analysis for their portfolios. Now I need to speed up. User need 5 is they really wanted us to cover transition and physical risk. So far we used the modeling frameworks to cover transition risk, and also had a branch of work which I'm not presenting here, where biophysical impacts were looked at for different temperature levels that we could link to the transition scenarios we did. But we had a shortcut and used the macroeconometric damage functions in the models to come up with damage estimates for our scenarios. And this is just an example for the case of the 1.5 degrees, the net zero scenario in blue, and the current policy scenario. So this is my last slide, which is 6th user need is that there should be conducive access to the NGFS scenario. So to make it users as easy as possible to access and understand them. And for that, we used some of the concepts developed in the census project that Cornelia just presented, developed a portal where people could access it, and you could, if you wanted, directly go to the data resource. You could download the data, you could access the YASA Scenario Explorer to get the data, you could read the technical documentation and have an overview slide per deck, but you could also go through some steps like interactive graphics, some explore modules where you could play around a bit in order to make you familiar with the scenarios you would get. And that covers it. Thank you.